June 8th, 1962, 2:47 p.m., 125th Street, Harlem. Mamie Johnson was walking out of the grocery store on Lenox Avenue when Vinnie Slick Terranova stepped in front of her. Vinnie was a Genovese soldier, 34 years old, with a reputation for collecting debts and intimidating witnesses. He'd been operating in Harlem for 3 weeks under orders to pressure local businesses into paying protection money to the family. "You tell your husband," Vinnie said, loud enough for the dozen people on the street to hear, "that this neighborhood don't belong to him no more. It belongs to people who actually matter." Mamie didn't respond. She tried to step around him. Vinnie grabbed her arm. "I'm talking to you," he said. Mamie pulled her arm away. "Take your hands off me." That's when Vinnie Terranova made the decision that would end his career and nearly destroy his family's position in New York. He slapped her. Not a push, not a shove. An open-handed slap across the face that echoed down 125th Street and stopped every conversation, every transaction, every movement within a 30-foot radius. Mamie Johnson stood there for 3 seconds, her face red where his hand had connected, her grocery bag on the sidewalk, staring at Vinnie with an expression that wasn't fear or shock. It was pity. Because Mamie Johnson had been married to Bumpy for 17 years, and she knew exactly what was about to happen to the man standing in front of her. Vinnie didn't understand what he'd just done. He thought he'd made a power move, sent a message, proven that the Genovese family could operate in Harlem without fear of consequences. He was wrong about all of it. Bumpy Johnson found out about the incident 11 minutes after it happened. He was in his office above Small's Paradise when Julius Gordon walked in without knocking, which Julius only did when something required immediate attention. "Mamie," Julius said, "125th and Lenox, Genovese soldier named Vinnie Terranova." He put his hands on her. Bumpy looked up from the ledger he'd been reviewing. His expression didn't change. "Is she hurt?" "No, but he slapped her. In front of witnesses." For 10 seconds, Bumpy didn't move. He just sat there, processing what Julius had said, running through calculations that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with what came next. Where is she now? Home. Illinois is with her. And Terranova? Still operating. He doesn't know we know yet. Bumpy stood up slowly and walked to the window that overlooked 135th Street. He watched the afternoon crowd moving through Harlem, people going about their business, living their lives, trusting that the neighborhood they called home was protected by someone who understood what that word meant. "Get me everything on Terranova," Bumpy said quietly. "Family connections, where he lives, who he works with, what he values most. I want to know everything by tonight." "What are you going to do?" Bumpy turned away from the window. "I'm going to teach the Genovese family why some lines don't get crossed." By 9 p.m. that night, Bumpy had a complete file on Vincent Terranova. Born in Brooklyn, 1928, married to Angela Terranova, 2 children, ages 6 and 8. Lived in a house on President Street in Carroll Gardens. Father was deceased, but his mother, Rosa Terranova, lived 3 blocks away, and Vinnie visited her every Sunday after church. Vinnie worked directly under Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, a Genovese captain who controlled labor racketeering and loan sharking operations in Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan. Vinnie had been arrested twice, convicted once, served 18 months for extortion. Most importantly, Vinnie was ambitious. He wanted to prove himself to the family, wanted a promotion, wanted to be seen as someone who could handle difficult territories like Harlem. That ambition had made him reckless, and reckless men made mistakes that couldn't be taken back. Bumpy spent 3 hours that night doing something most people would never associate with a man planning retaliation. He made phone calls to people who had nothing to do with crime. He called a jeweler in Midtown. He called a photographer in the Bronx. He called a woman who ran a boutique dress shop in Soho. He called a printer who specialized in custom work, and he gave each of them very specific instructions. What Bumpy understood
What separated him from men like Vincent Terranova was that violence is temporary, but awareness is permanent. Over the next 3 days, Bumpy orchestrated something that required more discipline than any shooting, more precision than any ambush. He had Terranova's entire life photographed without Terranova ever knowing he was being watched. A photographer sat in a car across from Rosa Terranova's church, capturing her Sunday morning routine. Another followed Angela to the grocery store, maintaining enough distance to remain invisible, but close enough to document every movement. A third positioned himself near PS 58, photographing the exact moment Vinnie's children arrived at school, the route they walked, the crossing guard who helped them across the street. Each photograph was developed professionally, arranged chronologically, and placed in a leather album that cost $200, the kind of quality you'd use for wedding photos or family memories. Bumpy reviewed every single image personally, making sure the message was unmistakable. I see everything you love. I know where they go. I understand what matters to you, and I've been watching while you had no idea. The album took 72 hours to complete, and when Bumpy finally held the finished product in his hands, he knew that Vincent Terranova would open it and understand immediately that this wasn't about revenge. It was about showing a man that his entire world existed at Bumpy's discretion, and that discretion was the only thing keeping it intact. June 12, 1962, 4 days after the incident.
Vincent Terranova was having breakfast with his wife and children when someone knocked on his front door. It was 7:30 a.m., earlier than he usually got visitors, but Vinnie wasn't concerned. He told Angela to stay in the kitchen and went to answer it himself. A courier stood on his doorstep holding a package wrapped in brown paper. "Vincent Terranova?" the courier asked. "Yeah." "Delivery for you. Sign here." Vinnie signed, took the package, and closed the door. The package was roughly the size of a shoebox, not particularly heavy, with no return address. He brought it into his study and opened it. Inside was a leather-bound photo album. Vinnie opened the album to the first page and went completely still. The first photograph showed his mother, Rosa, leaving church last Sunday. The photo was professionally taken, high quality, clearly shot from across the street. Someone had been watching her. The second photograph showed his wife, Angela, at the grocery store with their 2 children. The third showed their children's school, PS 58, with a timestamp, 8:15 a.m., the exact time they arrived each morning. The fourth showed his house from 3 different angles. Page after page, the album contained photographs of every person Vinnie cared about, every place they went, every routine they followed. His mother's bridge club, his son's baseball practice, his daughter's piano lessons, his wife's sister's house where the family gathered for Sunday dinner. Someone had been watching all of them for days, maybe weeks, and documenting everything. The final page of the album contained no photograph, just a handwritten note in elegant script. "You put your hands on my wife in public. I could put my hands on everyone you love in private, but I won't because I'm not you. This is the only warning you'll receive. Leave Harlem today and never come back. If I see you in my neighborhood again, this album becomes an instruction manual instead of a warning." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Vinnie's hands were shaking so badly he dropped the album. He stood in his study for 5 minutes thinking about his children walking to school, his mother leaving church, his wife at the grocery store. All of them visible, all of them vulnerable, all of them photographed by someone who could have done anything at any time and chose not to. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't sending a threat, he was demonstrating capacity. The difference between "I could hurt you" and "I could have already hurt you and chose not to" is the difference between empty threats and absolute power. Vinnie Terranova called Tony Ducks at 8:15 a.m. "I need to talk to you," Now. What's wrong? I'm pulling out of Harlem. You're what? I'm done. It's over. I'm not going back. Tony Ducks was silent for a moment. Come to the club. We'll talk about this. June 12th, 1962, 11 a.m. Vincent Terranova sat across from Tony Ducks Corallo in a social club in Greenwich Village and placed the photo album on the table. Open it, Vinnie said. Tony opened the album and went through it page by page, his expression darkening with each photograph. When he reached the final note, he closed the album and looked at Vinnie. Bumpy Johnson sent this? Who else? When? This morning. 4 days after Vinnie couldn't finish the sentence. After you slapped his wife, Tony said quietly. I didn't know. You didn't think, Tony interrupted. You put your hands on a man's wife in public without understanding who you were dealing with. I was making a point. You made a mistake. Tony pushed the album back across the table. This isn't a threat, Vinnie. This is a demonstration. He's showing you that he could have killed your mother, your wife, your children, anyone he wanted at any time in the last 4 days. But he didn't, because he's giving you a chance to walk away. So what do I do? Tony was quiet for a long moment. You do exactly what he told you to do. You leave Harlem today, and you never go back. And if I don't? Tony looked at Vinnie with something that might have been pity. Then everyone in that album becomes a target, and Bumpy Johnson doesn't make threats he isn't prepared to follow through on. This isn't about fear, Vinnie. This is about understanding that you crossed a line, and he's giving you one chance to uncross it. Vinnie left the meeting at 11:30 a.m. By 2 p.m., he'd informed every business he'd been pressuring in Harlem that he was no longer operating in the area. By 5 p.m., he was home, explaining to his wife that they needed to be more careful, more aware, more protected, and he never set foot in Harlem again. But Vincent Terranova's retreat wasn't the end of the story. The photo album made its way through the Genovese family's leadership over the next week. Tony Ducks showed it to his boss, who showed it to Vito Genovese's representatives, who discussed it in a meeting that included all 5 families. The reaction wasn't what Vinnie had expected. The families weren't angry at Bumpy Johnson. They were angry at Vincent Terranova. Because what Bumpy had done, sending a warning instead of retaliating with violence, demonstrating capacity instead of exercising it, giving Terranova a chance to retreat with his life and his family intact, that was the kind of move that made the families look weak if they responded with force. Bumpy had boxed them in perfectly. If they came after him for threatening Terranova, they'd have to explain why they were protecting a soldier who'd put his hands on an unarmed woman in public. If they didn't respond, they'd have to accept that Bumpy Johnson had set a boundary that their own man had violated, and that Bumpy's response had been more strategic and more effective than anything they could have done. Either way, Bumpy won. Within 2 weeks, the Genovese family issued a quiet directive. No operations in Harlem without explicit approval from family leadership. No soldiers were to engage with Bumpy Johnson or his associates without authorization. And anyone who put their hands on civilians, especially women, especially in public, would answer to the family, not to Bumpy. It was the first time the 5 families had changed their operational guidelines because of one man's response to one incident. And it happened because Bumpy Johnson understood something that Vincent Terranova never would. Power isn't about how much damage you can do. It's about how much damage you choose not to do, and making sure everyone knows you made that choice. May 8th, 1962. A mobster slapped Bumpy Johnson's wife in public. 4 days later, that mobster received a photo album that made him leave Harlem forever. 2 weeks later, the entire Genovese family changed their operating procedures. And for the rest of his life, Vincent Terranova would wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking about those photographs, thinking about how close he'd come to losing everything that mattered. thinking about the fact that Bumpy Johnson had held his family's lives in his hands and chosen to let them go. Not because Bumpy was weak, because Bumpy was strong enough to know that the most powerful thing you can do to someone isn't destroy them. It's show them you could have and chose not to. That lesson stays with the man forever, and it makes sure he never forgets why some lines don't get crossed. The story of the photo album became legend in New York's underworld, told and retold in different versions with different details, but always ending the same way. Bumpy Johnson protected his wife's honor without spilling a single drop of blood. No shootouts, no bodies, no war. Just a leather-bound photo album, and a message so clear that even the 5 families had to acknowledge it. In Harlem, you don't touch what belongs to Bumpy Johnson, and if you're foolish enough to try, you don't get a second chance. You get one warning, and if you're smart, you take it.